How are you?
Hi, Ms. Williamson. It's so nice to see you.
It's so nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. I'm Lynn Schollett with the Coalition.
So
Thanks for
nice
joining
to
us
meet you.
today.
Hi, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you.
Have a seat. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Lovely to be here with you.
Well, thank you. We are so happy to welcome you today to
Thank
the
you.
Coalition. And I hope
Thank
you're having
you.
a great time in New Hampshire.
I am having a great time in New Hampshire. And how beautiful is this weather, huh?
Well, we're pretty lucky today. If you don't get blown away, which could happen. So, well, my name is Lynn Schollett, and we are so happy to welcome you here to the
Thank you.
Coalition. Linda Douglas, the Trauma-Informed Services Specialist.
Thank you.
And Miller, the Comfort Dog, is also here to be part of our conversation
I was
today.
being told about comfort dogs. That's really beautiful.
Absolutely. So this is our part of our First in the Nation Victims' Rights series. We as the Coalition are the umbrella organization for 13 community-based crisis centers that serve about 15,000 survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and dating violence every year. We're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't endorse candidates, but we do feel that it's incredibly important to have conversations with candidates like yourselves, with our elected officials, with our communities about the impact of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. So we're thrilled to have you be part of that dialogue here today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. Many people here in the room, including Linda, have been following your work for many years.
Thank you.
Especially your focus on resiliency. We feel like it's such an important component of the work to help survivors heal. So we're happy to have you here today, and would love to start off just by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your understanding of adverse childhood experiences. I know really important in your work, and how your prospective administration would work toward improving the quality of life for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and anyone who's impacted by trauma.
We had 45 million tech companies told us that there were 45 million impressions of sexual assault and violence against children last year alone, that they found 45 million. And we had 4 million cases of reported violence against children, sexual and otherwise violence against children last year. Obviously, this is a problem that goes way beyond not only the capacity of our current agencies to be able to handle, but I think even way beyond what the American mind has really embraced and grasped. It's so horrifying. We have 13 million hungry children in the United States, and anytime you have a number like that, 13 million hungry children, that means they're growing up in poverty. We have about anywhere from about 39 million people living in poverty in the United States, 93 million who are in near poverty. We have 100,000 children who are homeless in the United States. We have millions of American children live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where the violence in their families, on their streets, and in their communities is so great that psychologists tell us that they're experiencing a level of PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. The level of human anxiety, the human trauma, and so many times we know this, we know how often the perpetrators of violence are people who were perpetrated against, particularly within childhood. So what we have, unfortunately, in the United States is a situation in which over the last 40 years, we have lost the idea that government is here to serve its people. We have embraced the idea that government is here mainly to advocate for the financial gain of a very small group of people. Short-term profits for huge multinational corporations is somehow considered more important than your life is. How did that happen? How did that happen? I thought life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness granted by God is an inalienable right for all citizens. Government's here to institute it to secure those rights. And I'm running because it also says in the Declaration of Independence that if government is not doing that job, then it is the right of the people to alter it. Now, I'm not an anti-capitalist, but there is a virulent strain of capitalism that has infected not only our economic system, but corrupted our government. This has been going on for 40 years. And to be honest, a woman particularly who has been victimized and is trying to get back up on her feet, is of no use to this virulent strain of capitalism. Your children are of no use to this virulent strain of capitalism, and older people are of no use to this virulent strain of capitalism. And because the government does more to advocate for that economic system than for us, then you're always going to be begging. victims' rights, like please. The American people have been reduced to saying pretty please about things that should be considered what we do here in this country. So if you're down and out for any reason, if you went through a bad situation with the wrong guy, the wrong husband, wrong parents, then you are all that you can hope for is that there's somebody who's going to be going around saying, well, let's see what we can do. Let's have a program. We need something much more fundamental than that, which for me, I want to establish United States Department of Children and Youth. We need trauma. We need so much more than just money for classrooms. We need so much more than just money for teachers. We need so much more than just universal preschool. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need community policing back. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. We need mindfulness in the schools. So when I hear and read and meet you, everything that this organization represents, this is not just, oh, and we have this small problem over here. This represents a huge sea of unnecessary human suffering, which is for all intents and purposes invisible to the ruling order of the United States. And it's going to take, and I know it's difficult when you're living through a difficult time in your own life, to rise up and be part of a real fundamental social change, but that's what it's going to take. And I think those of us who have been hurt the most are actually, it's counterintuitive, because it seems like I have to get my own life back together before I can be part of the big change. But I think being part of the big change is part of what helps us get our lives back together.
I love that you said that, because the way that we approach this work with our crisis centers is from a perspective of empowerment, that we stand with survivors. We're not telling survivors what to do. We're certainly not giving direction. We recognize that survivors are the experts in their own lives and know best what they need to move forward. And we're there to help support them in that process. So it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with our trauma-informed services specialist, Linda Douglas. Linda, can you talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing, and especially around adverse childhood experiences?
Well, 10 years ago, I was hired on to help programs enhance the services that they gave to women and children who've been affected by substance abuse and mental illness under that trauma-informed umbrella. And then we started to hear more and more about the adverse childhood experiences study that came out of California. And it became my job not only to educate the people that work at our crisis centers, but I also have been spending a lot of time educating our Department of Children, Youth, and Families. I spoke to a number of people from there this morning, going into, I train police officers, I've gone into schools and talked to teachers about the importance of trauma-informed school systems and how to understand what's going on with children who've experienced a number of traumas and adverse childhood experiences from a very small age, and maybe even before they were born, so that we can all understand the effects of trauma, and instead of looking at people and wondering what's wrong with them, we realize that something bad must have happened to them, and so we respond based on that, and then trying to reduce those bad things happening to children.
That's why we need an entire department. The reason I want a Department of Children and Youth, everything that you're saying represents a phenomenon which, responding to the phenomenon that you just described, will take more than what we now have available through Health and Human Services, more than what's available through the Education Department. We have to recognize that the vulnerabilities and the challenges of our children are so great, and so many millions of children are involved here, that I want a coordinative, I want a whole department where I get to see what are all the challenges, what are all the vulnerabilities, because otherwise we're just going to be passing this on to the next generation. We're never going to even catch up. When I meet with the people, and I assume what you have in New Hampshire is what I see all over the country. You have the social workers, you have people like yourselves who know what to do. I'm sure there are people in this room, and a lot of the people who most know what to do are people who themselves are survivors, because no one knows what the answer is like somebody who knows what the wound is. We have the people who would know what it is. We've got to cut this off in childhood. This is how the perpetual it perpetuates itself. But that's why I want an entire Department of Children and Youth, so that we can coordinate all of these efforts. It's bigger than just education.
Yes.
And we have one mental health counselor for every 1,500 children in the schools in the United States. We need so much more. We need, and a lot of the violence prevention, a lot of the bullying prevention. For instance, we have things now, give you an example, some of these trans children, transgender children. Well, usually I see this, a woman who's a policewoman in diversity training. It used to be diversity training meant diversity of color. Now it's also diversity of sex and sexuality. The country, so much has changed, and our institutions are not changing along. So you see organizations like yourself, the most forward-thinking work was being done in nonprofit organizations, etc. And many of us thought, well, that's just where you stay, and you do it because the government doesn't know what's going on. But now the problem is so overwhelming. The government needs to be more filled with people who do know what's going on.
Thank you.
Which is a great opportunity for us to talk about some innovative work that's being done. And one of our other special guests who's here today, Miller, is here with his handler, Officer Kristin Tracy from the Franklin Police Department, which is nearby. And Miller is one of a growing number of comfort dogs that is working with victims of crime and law enforcement officers throughout the state of New Hampshire. So Linda, could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing around the state with comfort dogs, and then we'll turn it over to Officer Tracy.
Well, comfort dogs provide so many things, and one of the big things they do is, particularly at child advocacy centers, when a child is disclosing something that's happened to them, that could be sexual abuse or otherwise, oftentimes an animal sitting next to them will help them to be grounded because they can touch that animal, and help them to have someone to talk to besides a human being. The child will open up to an animal before they'll open up to another person. Also, having a dog on site when they're just in the midst of the trauma has just occurred, can give the child something to do and to feel safe, and something to just distract them and help them. And I think, Officer Tracy, you can probably give us a couple examples of things that Miller's already done at 8 months old.
So obviously we're seeing things, we're first responders, so we're typically responding when someone's in the crisis, in the moment. So a lot of the work we do is on scene with a victim, whether it's children or an adult. So most recently, it varies, the crimes vary, but most recently we had 3 young kids that were taken out of what we're calling the House of Horrors. We just stumbled upon the living conditions they were in a home in Franklin, and so we were able to take 3 children out of the house, bring them back to the police department, and it took pretty much the whole day for DCYF and other services to do the ex parte, go through the court system, and then meet with the parents at the police department to remove them from the home and place them in foster care. So luckily Miller was on duty, and we were with the kids, I think it was like 3 or 4 hours at the police department, and it just, like you said, distracted them, but it was also very comforting. And that mostly everyone loves dogs, and especially kids, so it really just took their mind off of what was going on, and gave them something to talk about, and really
He's posing.
One of the things that was being talked to by a chief of police in a major city, and he was talking about how when police would have to do a raid, for instance, and they might have to arrest one of the parents, that there was no setup whereby a mental health counselor would be going back to check on those children who saw this happen, who went through the trauma of watching mommy or daddy get carried away. And I do understand that the policeman could say to put the kids in another room and have something like a dog to help the child. And we have to realize that the problem is so much more overwhelming even than that we not only have to have comfort for the child, the dog would be helping the child during that hour, but that we have to have also mental health counselors who go to check on that child a week later, 2 weeks later, and so
So
forth.
we're doing a lot of follow-up afterwards.
that's really great.
Another example, we, unfortunately, the first week of school, we had a 12-year-old and two 13-year-olds attempt suicide. And that was all within 1 week of each other. And so we actually did a lot of follow-up with them within the schools. When one of the juveniles came back from a mental health facility, Miller was there to walk her back
That's
to her
really
class. So that's something that we're focusing on too. It's not just the initial contact.
That's
it's
really
the follow-up,
fabulous.
at least within our community. You know, to keep that relationship, obviously they're probably going to have more needs down the road. So just to have that relationship with the dog.
The very fact that you have this, and the very fact that you have it not only at that moment but continuing, is an example of the kind of work being done within the institutions such as law enforcement to move the needle forward. And we all as citizens need to remember how much work we need to do and how much work obviously is not being done, that we have this many number of children trying to commit suicide anyway. We have elementary school students in this country on suicide watch. And I think all of us need to, as citizens, ask ourselves, what has gone wrong here? This is why I also want to have a U.S. Department of Peace. We need conflict resolution. We need restorative justice. We need anti-bullying. We need anti-violence. We need violence prevention. Something, I think we need to recognize the deep, where things have gone wrong in such deep sinews that we can't just always be trying to treat the symptom. Given that there are all these traumatized children, we can do things such as this. We have to ask ourselves, what is going on that there are so many traumatized children? We have to ask ourselves, for instance, like when you see something like the 45 million impressions on the internet that tech companies, that was last year alone, 45 million impressions of sexual and violent transgression against children on the internet. And then we have to look at the fact that that's a $60 billion industry. But you know what, when I lived in Michigan, and a friend of mine was on the Supreme Court of the state, and she was very active in this field, and she was able to make a phone call to someone in the FBI that I was only able to listen to because she was my friend. This was not a call I would have been able to be privy to otherwise. And they were talking about violence against children and violence against women and so much of this. And what he said on that call that I have not forgotten is, we know what's going on. We know much more than you think we know about where it is and who it is. But we simply do not have the resources. We simply are not given the resources that we need to go after the people we need to go after. And that's change in government. And that has to do with where you're putting your money. And that's how I started talking today. Women, girls, kids, what's that compared to a tax cut for the very, very wealthiest who want to buy a second $100 million home?
Right, seriously. Thank you, officer.
Thank you
really
so
very
much.
Very much appreciate it.
It must be nice for you too, given what you do for a living, that you get to give all this life-giving comfort to people as part of your job.
Yep, it's really nice just to have the resource
Yeah.
that otherwise someone wouldn't talk to us because, police and they have,
Yeah.
they have that persona, but having the dog is just an immediate icebreaker, and people feel more comfortable coming to talk to me and telling me about whatever it is that's going on with them, so makes our job a little bit easier.
So thank you so much. So the issue of criminal justice reform has been a prominent part of national conversations lately. Unfortunately, what we're observing is that most of the conversations are focusing on those individuals who've been accused or convicted of crimes. And what we know is that crime victims, as you've already alluded to, are at a distinct disadvantage in the criminal justice system. And day in and day out, our programs see that many victims choose not to come forward and even report because of fear of how they'll be treated in the system or what they know about other people they know and how they've experienced the criminal justice system. We also know that accountability for offenders who are convicted of serious crimes is important in stopping the cycle of violence that happens. So we wanted to ask you if you can commit to broadening the existing conversations around criminal justice reform to ensure that the voices of victims are heard in that conversation as part of a meaningful dialogue.
And some of the victims become perpetrators because they were forced to be perpetrators. This is the women's clemency issue. How many women are in prison in the United States today because the boyfriend or the husband did the drug deal or did the murder, and then says to the girlfriend or the wife who he has raped or he has hurt, so she knows how violent he is, and he says, you will help me hide the body, or you will help me hide the drugs, or I will kill your little brother, or I will kill your parents. And she has every reason to believe him. She ends up with a longer prison sentence than he does. And in many states, it's not even allowed that that evidence is produced in court. So they just know that she was an accomplice, but the jury never hears, well, she was an accomplice because she was told that if she didn't act as an accomplice, he'd kill her little brother, and she knows from the way he's beating her up that he probably meant it. So many times, and this issue of women's clemency is extremely important, how many women are in prison in the United States for basically self-defense measures that any of us would have looked at and go, what was she supposed to do? And yet, because of misogyny, because of unconscious biases, because of biases on the part of the courts, often this is the case. It's a cycle of violence, isn't it? And this is one of the reasons why I believe, one of the reasons I feel I'm running is because the 20th century conversation treats this piece over here and this piece over here and this piece over here. When really in the 21st century we have a much more holistic, whole person perspective. Everything relates to everything. You can't separate poverty from any of this. You can't separate the fact that we base our educational funding on property taxes from any of this. You can't separate any one issue from any other issue, and we have to look at it as a whole. But the victims' rights, on one hand, as they say about the United States prison system, it's too easy to get in, it's too easy to get out. So I do believe some people who are in there were victimized, men and women, by the society before they even got in there. Like I said before, we know how many violent offenders were themselves perpetrated against. But at the same time, you're absolutely correct. My cousin was murdered. And to be in that courtroom, you would have thought that the jury, the story, the narrative the jury gave really was given, well, if you had had in-laws like he did, you might have shot somebody too. I have seen firsthand how this can work.
Yeah, I'm very sorry for your family's loss.
It was a long time ago. Thank you so much, but
still can be very real.
Yeah, it's very real.
Yeah.
He got 5 years. He shot her in the broad daylight in the driveway, and neighbors saw it.
And he got five whole years.
5 years.
I'm sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that highlights one of the really valuable components you're bringing to this conversation, that we really believe the whole life cycle is interconnected. And when we look at the prison population today, to have a meaningful dialogue about why people are there also means moving upstream some. How can we focus our attention, rather than just on emptying prisons now, on the prevention that will stop these events from happening in the first place?
Well,
And
that's why
what we really want to see integrated into this conversation.
That's why I feel so strongly about United States Department of Children and Youth, which is an essential aspect of my campaign. We have to have a table where we get to coordinate and really address at a deep causal level all the various challenges and vulnerabilities of children.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this, after 9/11, we know what happened because the CIA wasn't communicating that day with the FBI, right? Remember all the talk about Muhammad Atta's computer. So that's where Homeland Security came from. Department of Homeland Security was established really to coordinate a lot of things that already existed. That's what we need to do with children. So we already have, we're beginning, people are getting it about the community wraparound services. I think one of you were mentioning it. So the child, later we came and the child also was visited by the dog. We're starting it because people get it, but we need to start putting that into the government. Right now, all we have is Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. This is so, everybody in this room knows this is so much bigger.
That's right.
This is so much bigger. You can't separate hunger, you can't separate poverty, you can't separate violent abuse, you can't separate some of the, there are some very evil forces out there. There are evil forces out there. To do with sex trafficking. And once again, what I have learned is how many times we have law enforcement agencies who do know and are either underfunded in their ability to deal with some of this, or are even thwarted in their work.
No question.
In my travels around the state and talking to particularly teachers, they're seeing families struggle, and they have children who are living in homes where there's substance abuse, homelessness, domestic violence going on, and the kids are having a hard time engaging in those activities that could increase their resilience.
Of course.
And these things are, it ends up that the teachers feel like that not only do they have to be teachers, but they also have to be social workers.
I hear it everywhere. Teachers who say to me, I wasn't trained to be a behavioral therapist. I was trained to be a teacher. And this is why we're losing teachers. This is why so many teachers are just saying, I can't do this anymore. And teachers who say to me, these young ones aren't going to last 5 years. Because they don't know what they're coming into. They think it's going to be this nice little, ABCD on the wall like it was in Dick and Jane books in the 50s. I know. I hear it everywhere I go.
So your Department of Children and Youth, what do you see are some practical things that could possibly come out of that could help teachers who feel like they have got so much more to do than just educating, and be able to support families and children on becoming more resilient?
Well, once again, everything connects to everything. That's why we use the term intersectionality today. First of all, poverty. We have 93 million Americans who live near poverty. And poverty is a main determiner of whether or not there's child abuse. I'm not saying that rich people never beat their kids. And I'm not saying every poor person does. I'm not saying anything like that. But it increases the level. Societal dysfunction of all these things we're talking about arises from people who are living in constant and chronic tension and anxiety. When do any of us I got upset the other day, right? And I hit the hand, I hurt my finger. But that was just, Marianne had one day with one event and it got me upset. There are people who live with as much pressure and stress as I lived with in that hour, almost every hour of every day. And we know in situations like that, who is going to get the abuse first? The weakest member of the family system. We've got to just face this. So first of all, the eradication of poverty. We had a president in the 1960s who had a war on poverty. We used to have something called the Office of Economic Opportunity, which in the 80s was closed. And it was closed, and instead that money was given through block grants to the states instead of being given directly by the federal government to anti-poverty agencies in local communities. Well, block grants is a euphemism for block it on the state level. So we don't have a government right now that exists to really help people. We've made helping people like it's wrong. Like that's just codependency and enabling people, and they need to get themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, that's great if you have boots, right? So whenever you have poverty, whenever you have hunger, 13 million hungry children, we've got 43 million hungry Americans. Hungry. We're the richest country in the world. You have too many people living without hope. Too many people living without any level of hope. And then we're telling them they should be resilient. Well, of course we have to help people be resilient. But I think there are many people in this room know that it's not just what happened to me. It's that it's a cycle of what happened to me. It's these cycles. And there is much we can do on the level. A lot of it is personal. A lot of it is in the nonprofit world. A lot of it is in the spiritual world. All of these I'm very, very well aware of, and have lived 35-year career with the nonprofit, with the spiritual, with I understand. But also there are levels of economic and social and political policy, even our food. Do you know how many of the children that we're talking about having behavioral problems didn't have a healthy meal that day? And many of them didn't have a healthy meal because their parents couldn't afford a healthy meal. Many of them didn't have a healthy meal because they're living in food deserts where a healthy meal wouldn't have even been available to them. We know how, but we have contaminants in our water. We have carcinogens in our food. We have toxins in our air. We have food. Do you know, and it sounds like, oh, food does matter. If a child didn't have a healthy breakfast, it is harder. It is harder for that child to learn. A lot of, even like the ADD, and we say, well, the kids can't concentrate. Well, they don't have that in France. Well, why is that? And then here, and all we're doing is coming up with pharmaceutical answers. So that this is something else we should be realizing. So you have schools handing out pharmaceuticals to these young children. Don't think that just because it's a legal drug, you can't get addicted. All of these things.
And the issue comes in that a number of these children who are being diagnosed as ADHD, actually what they're presenting with is a trauma response to all of the things that's been going on with them.
Of course.
And the pharmaceuticals are just a means of trying to control.
That's right. I'm so glad you used the word control. Not help, control.
Yes.
This is...
Yep. So with these initiatives that you're going to have to try and reduce the trauma and despair that happens, how are you going to make sure that victims' voices, those people who have been have experienced the direct effects of the violence and the poor practices of administrations before, what are you going to do to make sure that those voices are heard?
Well, the voices need to be more than heard. The voices need to be heeded. Mm-hmm. Because we all know that as women. Yeah. Right. I hear you, darling. Right. No. The voices need to be more than heard. Voices need to be heeded. There is a lot that we can do, mainly working with organizations such as yours. A lot of that is private-public partnership. A lot of that is no one would know better than people, it's like in Alcoholics Anonymous. Someone who themselves is in recovery can be the best counselor for someone getting out. So let's say someone comes to an organization like yours. A woman has been victimized, and she receives the kind of help that she needs in order to get her life back together. And you bring in faith voices and psychological voices and all kinds of nonprofit organizations. So whether it has to do with job counseling, whether it has to do with people who help her have some place to live, whether it's somebody who sets her up with a support system, somebody who gives the kind of help that we know is needed, social workers. The problem is not that we do not know what to do. The problem is that we do not fund the situations that do them.
Yes.
That's the problem. So you have an organization such as yours. I don't know the specifics of that, but what I see is the people who are doing the most important work in America are having fundraisers, hoping to raise $50,000, hoping to raise $100,000, while I see politicians giving subsidies of hundreds of millions of dollars to industries and entities who, because they're taking that money, are contributing to all this misery. This is the cycle. And what you need is a president and other lawmakers who know who you're working for. That you're not working for them because you have to work for them because that's where the corporate donations are coming from. It's this corrupt. We are going to have to stand up and stop this. If we want this cycle of violence to stop, we're going to have to stop with the cycle of violence by which huge masses of money are given to the actual forces that make all this suffering inevitable. Right, that's exactly right. Not by, it's like a society can have a blind spot, just like a person can. So it's not like a bunch of mean people sitting there. It's just corruption in the system that has gone so far. And what you're saying is absolutely true. So the awakening that's necessary, this is a perfect example. It can't just be who the president is. It's got to be who your governor is. Yep. Mm-hmm. It's got to be who your state reps are, and also something like that, your school board. Yes. Don't kid yourself. The school board really matters. And maybe
We've
there are
learned
people.
that here in Concord.
Pardon?
We've learned that here.
Yeah, I
in
bet you
Concord.
have. Have either of you ladies run for the school board
We
yet?
do have some elected officials in the room, so that's
Okay,
good.
good. Well, then I would assume if there are any elected officials in the room, if I'm saying anything wrong, I hope you raise your hand and say, well, it's not quite like. Or if I'm saying anything right, say, you go, girl.
Absolutely. Well, we are huge proponents of the community involvement, and we really
Yeah.
believe that it's as a partnership. And I would add judges to your list. I have to say, I
Yes.
feel like they are
Yes.
so high on the list in terms of elected officials who make a real difference.
I want to say one more thing, though, about women and when we go through those down cycles of our lives. Be careful with words like victim. Because you might have been victimized, but it's up to you whether or not you see yourself as a victim. Because what can happen psychologically and emotionally is that we can over-identify with our victimization. And and it's really, like I said, it's counterintuitive, but you might say, I will take part in all these things we're talking about here once I'm healed. But actually taking part in things like this is part of what helps us heal. When you've been victimized, it's all the more important to take part in activities which you're telling not only the society, but your own subconscious mind, I am not a victim. Something like, if you've been through the kinds of things you're talking about here, you should be one of those people out on the street registering people to vote.
Yep.
Spend some time every day doing that which is generating the new growth and the new beginning, not just focused on healing from the old wound.
And I know we have people in this audience today who have been doing exactly that.
Well, I would think
I would
think that's what you do in this organization. I would
It
think
is.
that's what this organization is about.
We are all about raising the voices of survivors and allies who support survivors. So with our last few minutes, I think we'll turn it to our audience. I think there are a few questions out there. Are there questions folks would like to ask? I see Jennifer raising her hand.
Hi, Ms. Williamson. Here in New Hampshire, our Department of Children, Youth, and Families is experiencing caseloads above the recommended national average and high turnover rates of workers. This, in turn, has resulted in child deaths, sexual abuse, and children living in unsafe homes. Our governor has recently approved additional resources. However, the department is still working to hire in order to keep up with attrition and the ever-growing demands due to the opioid crisis. How would you work to support overextended resources, such as government departments tasked with overseeing the safety of our children?
Well, there are two issues, working on the symptom, working on the cause. First of all, you said that the governor has given additional resources. Most of the time, given the level of we're talking about a huge sea of human suffering here. I mean, we talk about these things, and we want to, in the 21st century, not just take these children and these women are not just data on a page. These are human lives we're talking about here. And yet, even usually, for the most part, when our state governments or our federal government talks about giving additional resources, they're not talking about anything close to the resources that are needed. Because if you talk about the resources that are needed, you're talking about what would be a shift in the economic paradigm that rules America. If you're giving a $2 trillion tax cut, where 83 cents of every dollar are going to the largest corporations and richest individuals, even though there's not even any evidence that tax cut will ever pay for itself. When you're talking about $26 billion in subsidies to oil and gas alone last year, it's already making multi-billion-dollar profits. When you're talking about a national security budget that takes the money the military asks for, which I think we'd all agree the military should get what they ask for, but then you've got hundreds of billions of dollars above that they didn't ask for, but that defense contractors want the government to spend to increase their own bottom line. When you're talking about the United States giving big pharmaceutical companies the right to keep the government from negotiating for the lower drug prices, then what are you going to have? Additional resources. So the money that I just described to you is in the billions and trillions. The money I just described to you, $2 trillion tax cut, hundreds of billions for defense contractors. I just talked to you about billions and trillions. And when they talk about additional resources, they mean we spent $5 million more. This is what we're talking about. Whenever they talk about helping women and children, additional. Do you think they say to oil and gas, we're going to give you additional resources? They say we're going to give you a huge multi-billion-dollar subsidy. They're not talking, quote unquote, additional resources. So that's number one. That's on the level of symptom, that we need massive. And what I've been saying in my campaign, we need a massive realignment of resources in the direction of our children. Not incremental here and incremental there. We need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. That's number one. And then the level of cause. And the level of cause is the other things we've been talking about more than anything. Poverty and near poverty. We have an 11% poverty rate, but we have a near poverty rate. I was at a meeting earlier today, and this man said, and he's not really wrong, he's not that wrong. He said they keep talking about the middle class. He said we have done, this economic theory in the last 40 years has done so much to devastate our middle class. We're really more than not, we're the privileged, the working poor, and the poor. So we have to get down, we have to do some much more honest and radical truth telling. We need a lot more than additional resources. We need massive resources, and we need to stop doing the things that make this stuff probable.
Honest and radical truth telling.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Girls can do it. You know, I always say, no, great respect to the men in the room. I do believe, in my campaign, what I feel, and I've felt this throughout my career, I'm not saying anything everybody I know isn't saying. I'm just saying it when the microphone is on. I did not say anything today we don't all know. I did not say, I mean, maybe there are little details or something, but we all know this. We need now the courage to stand up and say it. And we know as women, you know, we all know this, you won't necessarily get applause. But you'll get applause, you know, this is another interesting thing. I read a study, and this study said that if a woman, and it was talking specifically about women, but I think this would be the same even if it wasn't just about women, but this was about women, which is interesting, that if one woman stands up and says something that is counter to the sort of quiet that's in the room and nobody's saying what we're all thinking, right? One woman says, well, I think that's crazy. And I think what we really should do is blah, blah, blah. If no one else speaks up for her, then the system, there will be silence in the room, and everybody will go on as usual, nobody really saying it. But what this study was saying is if one woman says it, and even one other person, and that said it could be a man or a woman, one other person will say, actually, I agree with her. The whole system will change, and the conversation will be out in the open.
So I want to say thank you to you
Thank
for
you.
being that voice at the table and
Thank
raising
you.
these issues. And it's a room full of folks who would stand with you and
Thank
say,
you.
we agree and we appreciate all
Thank
the
you.
issues you're raising. You're really advancing this dialogue in such an
Thank you.
important way. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
God
you.
bless you for the important, very important work that you're doing. And
Thank you.
God bless all of you and your work you're doing. And for those of you who need to heal, my heart is and prayers are with you.
Thank you
Thank you so much.
much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being
Thank you,
here.
everyone.
Let's get a few pictures.